But if you've read his biography, you know that among many things, as working as science director at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum for years, being a full college professor for many years, he also is a MacArthur genius. And I mention that because you might periodically drive along and you listen to the radio and it talks about the MacArthur Foundation, MacArthur genius. You're like, I wonder what that means. In Gary Nabhan's case, it's the real thing. Why do I say that? Gary is the kind of person, you stand in a building, you look out the window, and he sees something different than you see or other people would see. You're like, well, that's interesting, isn't it? He's brought a wide breadth and deep depth of knowledge to the things he's studied and the people he's worked with for now 2 generations. So it's an honor to have him here, and I appreciate all of you being here to share it. Please welcome Dr. Gary Nabhan. You can elbow bump. There you go.
Well, thank you all for coming out and enduring all the uncertainty in the world today. When we gather like this, despite things that might otherwise dissuade us from what we'd love to be doing, meeting with other friends and family and neighbors, I think we're saying, we know there's real risks in the world, but we don't have to buy into fear. And so I'm grateful that all of you came out. I think we're going to have some fun tonight, because we're going to mix food up with conservation. And the founder of Slow Food in Italy once told me that American conservationists aren't having as much fun as they should be having being conservationists. That if you're an Italian, you make sure that there's good wine and good bread and good olives on the table every time you go out and visit a sustainable farm, or when you go out and see a wildlife conservation project. The sensory pleasures of protecting land for wildlife or for rare plants is something that they celebrate with all their senses, not just with their head or their heart. And that changed my life, hearing a guy who is head of a whole international movement say, have fun at protecting the world and restoring it, and celebrate the successes that you have as you go along, rather than just working your tail off and not taking time to smell the roses or the wine, if it's wine you like more than roses. So we're going to do a little bit of that tonight. And the other theme of this is obvious from the title here, that I think that now more than at any point in American history, we need to put aside our divides and walk toward the middle and find ways to collaborate for the benefit of our communities and for future generations. That's not just a nice thing to do anymore, but it's essential to both our health and the health of the land. And so if we engage right in healing the land through being involved in school gardens or ecological restoration, there's a way that feeds back into healing the wounds in our communities that are more and more evident. Just turn on any radio station or any TV station, and that's all you'll hear about, those wounds. And I think tonight we're going to celebrate what happens when people really do come together for the common good. So let's get started with that. First, greetings to all of you Earthlings. I'm from another planet that's a desert planet down on the US-Mexico border. I live 10 miles north of where that notorious border is, having a wall put up across it right now. But ironically, there's more good things going on between cultures and races and people of different backgrounds than all the stuff you hear in the news. One of the things is that our little town of Tucson, where I teach at the University of Arizona and worked at the Desert Museum there, became the first city of food cultures recognized by the United Nations, because we have these incredible threads of Native American, Hispanic, or Mexican cultures and Anglo or Northern European cultures all coming together in this very interesting dynamic way that is better than what you get in most Tex-Mex restaurants. It's something that really has the taste of the desert itself in it. And that urban initiative is backed up by an equally interesting rural initiative, a national heritage area for the food shed or the watershed that surrounds Tucson, the Santa Cruz River, that's actually a binational river. We're helping farmers and ranchers restore their lands and then also market their value-added products from the restored lands. So in ways the consumers are helping pay for the conservation through the products that they buy. And this isn't just good for the ranchers, it's good for all of us who love good healthy food, because on restored lands, these guys are not just increasing the flavor and the productivity, but really the taste and the value of their products. And because of work that we've done over 30 years of building coalitions for that kind of win-win work rather than lose-lose litigation, most people in our community understand that wildlife conservation matters, because ecotourism and wildlife tourism is a big part of our economy, and that land restoration is fundamental to that ecotourism and even hunting economies in our community. Whoops, what did I do there? I pushed the wrong button. How do I get back there? I'm going to need a little bit of help here. There. I pushed this button rather than that one. I'm sorry.
Which one did you hit?
I hit this, so it just came up with the. I do not think that is a desert bird. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. There we go. So I want to remind you that not just in Arizona, but across the whole country, we've seen this incredible grassroots movement of local conservation communities rallying diverse components of our society together for common causes. Everyone, to some extent, loves wildlife watching. Everyone loves fresh, clean, flowing rivers. Everyone loves having a kind of food system that not only nurtures the land, but nurtures our elderly who need good nutrition to have healthy lives until they pass into the other world. And in particular, in the desert, we're preoccupied by climate change because we've already suffered terrible droughts and heat waves and all of that. And we know that's going to be part of the future for a lot of Americans more and more. And so we feel we're on the front lines of finding solutions to how to deal with climate change that don't deprive us, but make our lives richer and more resilient and stable. So we're trying to make our communities more resilient at every level, in terms of the architecture and urban planning and how we design our schools and our other public buildings, that we're building coalitions of people from all diverse backgrounds, different faiths, different races, to deal with the social challenge that we have, like the immigration issues that you all hear about at the border. We're showing how once we begin collaboratively working together on projects like wildlife habitat restoration, that spills over not just to heal the wounds in our land, but the wounds in our society, old grudges between people or people who've kept one another at a distance for a while. And that we used to buy into the jobs versus environment debate, but now we're showing that whenever we build healthier habitats, there's more jobs created than we could have gotten any other way. And so we call that a restorative economy. And then we're exchanging different points of views, and in our place, we're blessed to have Native Americans who've lived in the desert for thousands of years that have had to adapt to other climatic changes. We're exchanging ideas with those different cultures about how to deal with the onset of other climate challenges. At the same time, there's a lot to celebrate in this community and in the community I live. We really have to be honest with one another that we have Grand Canyon-sized chasms that are dividing our nation. Maybe the biggest divides and conflicts in our country since the Civil War 150 years ago. And it makes a lot of us uncomfortable to even acknowledge that. And I'm not trying to be political and take any side. It's just the opposite. I want to see ways that we can find values in our neighbors who we've once looked askance at, so that we can begin to have a dialogue on what we agree on that our communities need for the health of our elders and our children and for our economy. And so if we're to avert more showdowns like the West had at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in the Northwest a few years ago, a standoff between FBI and ranchers and dissidents. Malheur, by the way, means misfortune National Wildlife Refuge. What an irony. We can't assume that those solutions are going to come from Washington, D.C., or even from our governor's office. It's not going to come from the top down. It's going to come from what we voluntarily do ourselves. You can't regulate goodwill. You have to grow into it because you trust your neighbor more and more, and you feel like you're given respect and they're given respect. But if you haven't noticed lately, all you need to do is flick the channels again. We're still in a lot of horrible standoffs in the USA, and they frustrate and frankly scare a lot of my students to death. They just don't know how they're going to maneuver and navigate all the conflicts in our society now. And they're suffering a lot of anxiety. And so at this point, I'm going to ask you to just air some of those things that worry you about the conflicts that we see at the local level, at the state level, the national level. And I'm not talking about political issues. I'm just talking about many other more basic things in that some people in urban areas don't get the values of rural people, or that immigrants and old-timers in a community have different ways of looking at it. Black versus white, beauty lovers versus utilitarians, meat eaters versus vegans. There's a dozen of these things. And at this point, I'd like to go in the participatory mode and ask you to turn to your neighbor and pair up 2 by 2 for the next 5 minutes. And each of you say, it doesn't have to be the divisions on this list, but which of these things cause you anxiety or sadness or frustration or grief that are happening in this country today? We're not going to talk about solutions yet. I just think we need to say we're facing some serious challenges here, and what are some of those? So pair up with a neighbor, and 1 minute before 5 minutes, I'm going to raise my hand, and then at 5 minutes, I'm probably going to whistle at you, and we'll come back together. Okay, let's do one more minute, kind of wind down. If one person has had a chance to talk, let the other one sort of finish up the conversation. Okay, let's reassemble here. Thank you for doing it. Sometimes you just have to say there's an elephant in the room, and I think in the United States right now, there are many things roaming around that we don't normally talk about that are scaring some of us. And yet at the same time, I'm sort of struck by this quote by A.C. Revkin. What needs restoring is not just American nature, like replanting a forest or a grassland, but what we need to restore is the nature of America. And how do we do that? I think that, again, some of this goes beyond talk, that we don't bury the hatchet or heal wounds by just talking them through with people who we presume to be opponents or enemies, but we do it by getting in the trenches, getting down on our hands and knees and planting trees, going out on a weekend and sowing a wildflower meadow, going out and cleaning up a river, and then start the process of protecting the riverbanks from more erosion. By doing that kind of work together on the ground with people that we assumed are of a different ideological background, we see their skills, their talents, and some of their values. And once we do that, it's not about the ideologies anymore. The guy who's handing you a tree or the woman who's offering you more wildflower seeds to sow out over a meadow is no longer an abstraction. It's someone working for the same common good that you are, that has a slightly different set of talent, skills, and values that you need as much as they need yours. And I think that's a starting point for healing the wounds. Can't be done in just a town hearing where one of my friends said, no one listens to each other in a town hearing anyway, so why do we call it a hearing? The point is that we really need to do work where it's not all about the words, that we see through our actions and the actions of those around us, that we can work together for the common good. Because of that, I think it's time that we rethink and expand what the definition is of the collaborative work of a community as diverse as this in Metro Cincinnati, in a 3-state area, and in the diverse habitats that you have around here. What can that work be, and who should it ultimately serve? First, let's remember that there's been other times, not just the Civil War, when Americans have faced real threats. And I think back to the Dust Bowl that greatly changed and shaped and in some ways wounded the lives of my parents. They were in the Midwest in places where counties blew away. And yet at the same time, there were communities of farmers and foresters with people with some of the same technical skills that you have in this room: landscape architecture, botany, wildlife management, restoration ecology, environmental education, local economics, that helped put those landscapes and communities back together again. So I'm going to tell you a little parable about one of those examples that happened during the Great Depression and Dust Bowl, where a place in the driftless region of Wisconsin that stretches out into Iowa was just blowing away. The soil was so fragile and friable that with changes in the weather and with poor management, I should say, of some of the people, all of a sudden there were 20-foot gullies in fields that used to be flat. The wildlife disappeared in a matter of years, and then other things started to go downhill. And so Hugh Bennett, who was the first director of what we now call the Natural Resource Conservation Service, it's gone through several names, and a young professor at University of Wisconsin that did forestry and wildlife, Aldo Leopold, went out to those communities, and they didn't tell them what to do. They listened. They'd go to the coffee shop in the morning in these small towns, and they'd listen to people talk about the problems that they were having, economic or environmental, and then ask them what they thought the solutions could be. They did listening sessions. They weren't experts saying, I have the idea, could you follow me? They listened to what the community wanted. And I think that's the starting point for all good work. And they called what they were doing cooperative conservation. Now most of the natural resource literature calls this collaborative conservation, but same thing. And in a matter of 10 years, they began to heal those gullies and restore the plant cover, because if they didn't do it, more people would starve. More people would be landless and have to move to California or some other place like the Okies had done. The water, they needed to clean up, or else their kids would be sick. The diminished wildlife populations, when people had nothing else to eat, if they'd over-exploited wildlife and ruined the habitats, they couldn't even get pheasant. And so they wanted to look at ways that rural incomes could increase again through taking better care of the land. And so Aldo Leopold's land ethic guided this process by the way he made people interact. He didn't shape the content of it. He said, let's have this collaborative process. That's all I want out of you. And Robin Kimmer, a Native American writer, is now in the New York Times bestseller book for books, Braiding Sweetgrass, calls this reciprocal restoration, because while you're healing the land, you're healing the community. What happened there is pretty amazing. 400 farmers got involved with University of Wisconsin faculty, students, grad students, springtime break people, the Federal Federal Workers Project, Soil Conservation Service began to work together on this, and they brought in hundreds of additional people who'd lost their jobs to help do erosion control, terraces, contouring, and all of that. And literally thousands of people were involved in these watersheds in healing the wounds there. Within a half century from that, those very same valleys and farms hatched what is now the largest farm and dairy collective in the United States. That's called the Crop Co-op, but many of you probably know it by the branding of their products, Organic Valley. So the same social and natural capital that they accrued and enhanced through healing the land, bringing back the wildlife, bringing back the grass cover, led to some of the first great organic dairy products in the United States. And that is now $100 million of value-added meat and dairy products, and still some vegetables per year. And when I met one of the founders of Crop, he's a guy in his late 70s with a sign in front of his house, one of Organic Valley's founders, and knocked on his door and said, what was that like being part of this incredible social movement that both healed the land and created all these jobs? He said, well, when I married into my in-laws and told them that I want to take the farm and make it part of a co-op, they said, that's socialist stuff, that's communist stuff, isn't it? And after we made our first $1 million of royalty, they all wanted to be communists with us. And so the state is now, the interesting thing is it's gone from Wisconsin to 32 states. They're constantly changing their decision-making processes. It's very dynamic. It's not the same thing it was when it started, to be more inclusive, but it's one of the most successful collaborative economic ventures in the United States. And it built itself out of that natural and social capital of restoring that landscape. Similarly, in the Western states, I was fortunate enough to be on the ground level of what we call rancher environmentalist collaborations that came out of litigation between the Farm Bureau and environmental groups. And that went on for 15 years, bankrupting some ranchers, bankrupting some environmental groups. And now there's 7 collaborations in the states that I work closely with. There's now about 19 of them altogether in 6 Western states. And they brought 3.8 million acres into co-management and restoration. They have as partners 250 federal, state, nonprofit, and for-profit agencies. And instead of the government telling the ranchers and farmers what to do, the government people are listening to them for solutions and trying to accommodate them. And they're on board with it because the workload is spread out between everyone. In the place where I lived for 10 years up near the Grand Canyon in Flagstaff, Arizona, it moved into a second phase where the rancher said, now we've restored the land, wildlife populations are going up, but people don't even know this is food producing land. Let's have a cooperatively owned restaurant in town where our range-fed beef is sold and celebrated within a block of City Hall. And now they have 3 of those restaurants in Arizona, and you see young punk rock kids sit next to old ranchers enjoying the same vegan and beef burgers and other local products. And now that ranching collaboration has a face on it, and people are eating good food from it every day. Similar coalitions have brought back rare fish stocks, endangered bison, sage grouse, quail, many, many other things all over the North American continent. And the rural traditions that go with those, how to butcher a bison so you take the bison hide and the horns and make other products to sell from that. So it's not just one product, but multiple ones. And how the bison themselves can be an agent of restoration by making buffalo wallows and other things that attract amphibians and wildflowers and sedges and butterflies. So it's kicking in a restoration product that then regenerates itself, a restoration process. The process keeps on moving once you've jump-started it, and then they have income streams that bring enough capital back in to keep that process going. So 2003, only 2 million pounds of buffalo meat entered the market, and most of that, frankly, was from feedlots. You just have 30 bison in a lot and bring in hay for them, and it wasn't very good beef. Within the last few years, after Wildlife Society of America, the Bronx Zoo, had a nationwide or continent-wide bison conference I helped facilitate the sessions and record them for Native Americans, Intertribal Bison Council. We've seen a quadrupling of bison production, and it's moved out of the feedlot back onto the landscape. And litigation between tribes and associated ranchers are declining. They're actually taking down the barbed wire fence so not just bison can roam, but other kinds of wildlife as well. More recently, we went through another crisis that Thane and I have talked a lot about. In about 1995, we first found out that honeybees were going down the tubes faster than we could have possibly imagined, and then nectar feeding bats. Then, of course, you all know what's happened to monarch butterflies the last 15 years. And hummingbirds were in steep decline too. So it wasn't just one kind of pollinator. You couldn't blame all of this on one factor like pesticides. It was a whole variety of factors. And unless we looked at the whole picture of the relationship between wildlands and our farmlands, we knew that we weren't going to solve it. It could not be solved by a piecemeal approach. So people that were on opposite sides of the fence. Organic farmers and conventional farmers who did use herbicides and pesticides felt that they were at odds with each other, but they knew that they had to collaborate or there'd be litigation from things like monarch butterflies having to be put on the Endangered Species Act, put on the protection list through the Endangered Species Act, that would have had repercussions throughout American agriculture if that had happened. So we started to do some interesting things. We formed a monarch conservation group where farmers, particularly organic farmers, were all of the advisors. The board of advisors was made exclusively of farmers. And they had all experimented with ways to reduce or halt herbicide and pesticide use, grow a more diverse set of crops, to have hedgerows and prairie filter strips and other things in the landscape that kept the pollinators in there. And their yields were going up. And they began to mentor other farmers. And they used their places as training sites through the Sustainable Ag Research and Education grants that the USDA came out. But that wasn't enough. We also had to talk to the industry, the biochemical industry, the genetic engineering industry, and say, you can't be out of the tent peeing on the tent. We need you in the tent working with us. And so all of a sudden, the dynamics of that whole effort changed dramatically. And what's happened from there is nothing less than extraordinary. I mean, you know of how many pollinator gardens you see at zoos and schools and botanical gardens wherever you travel. But every kind of organization, from churches to soil conservation districts to the Farm Bureau itself, began doing workshops on these things. And it spread from bees and monarch butterflies to other things. In Arizona, we had an endangered bat that pollinated the big columnar cactus. Here's a picture not far from a little fishing cabin we have in Mexico where the nectar-feeding bat is pollinating the flowers of the giant cacti. And we knew that those bats had been declining for 20 years. How could we turn that around? It's the same bat that pollinates the agave plants that are related to tequila. They were being over-harvested in the wild. How could we change that dynamic? And so we started to move towards a perennial agriculture where we are using the agaves and the cacti on the margins of fields as windbreaks, as shelter belts, as habitat for wildlife. And the yields of the fruit on those farms began to go up, 20 to 30%. The Brix content of the fruit, because there were more pollinators in there, were higher. They were more nutritionally dense. The price of the fruit, where we brought back the pollinators, began to go up, and the farmers could make a living off 4 acres of orchard, just that much, because the quality and the productivity with pollinators was better than what it was when the pollinators were absent. Those little tiny efforts that I know nearly every zoo in the country was involved in, every botanical garden, many school groups, have now trained over 70,000 farmers in the United States in how to protect pollinators on their back 40 and around their ponds, even in their fields and orchards. And more people are mobilized by that kind of effort than ever before in history. And for the first year, this last year, the monarch butterfly numbers started to rise again. That crisis is not over. We can't give up on it. It's not fully successful. We need to keep on doing the bridge building. But now we have the chance to create pollinator habitat on millions of acres that's being pulled out of cultivation because of the trade wars with China. Rather than fallowing that land that was in corn or soy, why don't we plant that with pollinators and subsidize the farmers to do pollinator habitat rather than to subsidize them to do dust control on the same fields? We're going to see that kind of thing spread for other reasons. In California and Arizona, we have water rationing, and some farmers have decided to irrigate their best acreage with all the water that they have for the whole farm and fallow other acreage to reduce their water budget. So we're working with them to do this shift where if they manage it right, they're getting incentives to put native plants back on the land that they can no longer farm because of lack of water. But then they get a benefit because of pollinators that nest and breed and reproduce on that land are then helping the yields of their crops. We have another crisis right now, aside from the coronavirus, one that's actually maybe more long-term and costly. That most of the kids in the US and Mexico are facing a life where obesity and diabetes are a real possibility for them. Mexico just became the most, the country with the most severe issues with childhood obesity and diabetes of any place in the world. In the southwestern US, from Texas to California, is in the same boat. And a lot of that is because our diet has become more homogeneous than ever before in human history. Italians, Chinese, Brazilians, and Canadians eat more alike than at any point in human history. And yet their diets, their bodies are adapted to all different kinds of diets, and yet we've homogenized them. And the cost of it is now remarkable because a one-size-fits-all diet simply will not work for the human diversity on this planet. And in Arizona, where I live, the collateral damage from that broken food system that produces too few nutritionally dense foods to really deal with the health needs of our population means that the hospital care for kids with diabetes and obesity is now greater than the farm gate income to all the farmers and ranchers in the state. What I'm saying is that the health impacts of a food system that isn't working for everyone is now greater than the benefits that the food producers themselves get out of that system. When the collateral damage is greater than the benefits, that's my idea of a broken food system and perhaps a broken society. So we're trying to change that. We're trying to change that because climate change is going to worsen it. All the diseases that are rising most rapidly in the world are diseases, what the public health people call diseases of oxidative stress. Kidney disease, diabetes that all have an influence of how much stress is on your body, and you need antioxidants to counterbalance that, but they haven't been available in your diet. So some of these nutritional issues are being exacerbated, not initially caused by the climate change that we're seeing today. So about 3 decades ago, we started dealing with this on the front lines of climate change in desert communities that have lost their water sources, that are living in temperatures of 120 to 130 degrees in the summer. And we started to build back into their food economy simple things like prickly pear fruit and prickly pear pads that you can eat just like green peppers in most salads and casseroles and soups. Mesquite pods from the most common desert tree that ranchers had been bulldozing under and planting with grass, but then they found out that most of what their cattle were eating between March and June wasn't grass, it was the mesquite pods from the trees, and they were spending all day in the shade of those trees and foraging at night for other things. They were basically nocturnal mammals rather than acting like cows. So we said, okay, what if we take little pieces like that and try to redesign an agriculture that hit 3 marks all at the same time? It was better for land health, it was better for community health or economic well-being, and it was better for human health. What if we had an agriculture that dealt with all 3 of those issues simultaneously? And that's what that maze of charts are is. What if we increase soil microbiome diversity and that helped better the gut microbiome that most kids have lost due to overuse of antibiotics? What if we took care of land health in a way that it had benefits to human health And what if all of that created more jobs? And so that's what we've been doing, trying to do new agricultural systems that can weather climate change and create more jobs through that transition. In Tucson, where I work, that's led to 50 new food micro-enterprises just in the last 6 or 7 years that now sell more than 120 nutritious, healthy, wild food products sustainably harvested, and things from regional heirlooms that are water-conserving, heat-tolerant crops. 120 new food products every day in our restaurants, cafes, gift shops, and farmers markets. Since the 2008 recession, altogether, we've grown 2,000 new jobs in the food sector because of all the attention put on this. We're getting $30 million of free publicity about our food innovations per year now from The Guardian, New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, National Geographic. And that, more than any other factor, has led to the economic recovery of our community from a 30% unemployment situation in 2008, where more than 100 restaurants went bankrupt, to restaurants moving to Tucson from other cities because they have all these distinctive desert flavors to showcase. None of this matters if it's just high-end restaurants, though. If it doesn't get to the people in who have the most serious health needs, it's a hollow victory. And so we're now looking at how we can help people who are doing roadside stands, selling potted plants at flea markets and swap meets, how we can get festivals to our community that feature all these people's agricultural and food products. And to do that, we have to build entrepreneurial leadership among the minority communities who are most at risk of losing their jobs. And 3 of the last 5 years, Arizona has been highest of all states in the Kauffman Index for entrepreneurial innovation. And it's not college-educated people per se that are leading that charge. It's family businesses, family food businesses that are leading the way. And some of that is providing the basic things to jumpstart someone's competence in growing plants for sale in an interesting way. I was one of the co-founders of a group called Native Seed Search 30 years ago when our librarians wanted to start a little seed library at one library branch. We gave them 1,600 varieties of seeds from the seed bank of vegetables and culinary herbs and beans and corn for free, no cost. And they decided to have a free seed library, not in just one library, but in all 19 in our county. And if the 200 or 300 kinds of seeds you see in that one library don't include the one that you see on the computer catalog, within 2 days, interlibrary loan will bring them to your library branch. 60% of those people who are recipients of free seeds from the library bring back part of their harvest to share with other people. In our town, 60% of the people who check out a book don't bring back the books, but they're bringing back the seeds because they're part of the gift that keeps on giving. And this isn't just our town. I'm sure I'm bragging to some extent about how we got up out of the poverty downturn through food systems recovery and habitat recovery in our town. The river's flowing for the first time in 100 years through Tucson. There's new nurseries, new orchards, new bike trails with edible landscaping on it. We're going for 1 million trees by 2025 in the town. But this is happening all over. And since 1985, when many of us first started working with Seed Savers Exchange and other organizations, we've had a quadrupling of food biodiversity in terms of the number of seeds, fruit trees, nut trees, and culinary herb varieties available in the United States. A fourfold increase in that. in a matter of 30, 35 years. So this is happening all over the place, and many of you are gardeners of heirloom varieties, and you're part of the solutions. It didn't come down from the USDA. It came up from communities like this, and now the USDA is paying attention to it. In the town I live, it's really hilly and rocky, and we'd already had a bird tourism economy there for years, and we decided, how can we expand the bird habitat for hummingbirds and monarch butterflies and other butterflies. We have 16 kinds of hummingbirds, 150 kinds of butterflies and moths, 3 nectar-feeding bats. How could we make more habitat for them that would attract more people? Because as one woman says in our cafe, I don't know who those people with field glasses and bird books are that talk Latin in the morning while they're drinking coffee, but they pay for my paycheck. And our tourism for pollinator watching has doubled from 15,000 to 30,000 people in a matter of a few years. Every state in the country and 24 different countries come to our little town of 800. With that, we've started 2 land trusts, a for-profit ecological restoration firm that works with ranchers, a for-profit nursery, and a nonprofit nursery and a nonprofit program for training high school kids and college-age kids in ecological restoration. The nursery below my house from the nonprofit propagates 50,000 plants a year of about 200 native species. Across the road from the nursery, we have a 1,600-acre wildlife corridor that's a land trust that may be used as a grass bank during drought years to help ranchers who are in need of more forage. And all of these things are interacting and have created about 70 jobs in our community, about 25 to 30 in these nonprofits. The amazing thing is we also have 136 high school kids that are involved in this work in the summer, and that's helping get them the money they need to go to college. So it's also an educational, up by your bootstraps kind of thing. So these are just a few ways that we're going from gridlocks and divisiveness to collaboration. And some people call this the radical center, and my last book was called Food for the Radical Center. Other people, organic and conventional farmers working together, call their collaborations the middle path, which to me almost sounds biblical or something from Buddha. Take the middle path, a spiritual trajectory. And in ways, it's enhancing people's lives in a way that is very spiritual. There's less acrimony in the community. There's more tranquility. Life feels better. So I encourage you all to consider the middle path at a time when we see so much divisiveness around. Think about that term, radical center. Getting at the roots of what's wrong in our community by walking into the middle together and getting things done that we couldn't do alone. And that means bridge building with people who you may have perceived as your enemies or adversaries. And that's hard, emotional work, but it's worth every moment we put into it. So I'm going to ask you all to stand up, and there's another participatory part of this. I'm going to marry all of you in one of those big mass weddings. Okay? So no, we're going to renew our sacred vows. And how this is going to work is I'm going to say a line there, and then I'm going to go like this, and you're going to say the same line. As earthlings, we pledge to revitalize nature. By planting gardens and restoring habitats. In ways that feed the hungry. For we know that all need nourishment. We now wish to renew our sacred vows. To take care, love, and serve the diversity of life on this earth. Through sickness and in health. In times of crisis and times of joy. We promise to move beyond divisions. To walk into the radical center. And take the middle path. We do so by sowing the seeds of food justice. By deepening the roots of community health. By cultivating participatory democracy. By fermenting true food sovereignty. And fermenting a few beers on the way. No, that's not in there. I'm sorry. Through our own actions and our own eating patterns. So that we may all be fed by what we have truly sown. We reaffirm our covenant with this earth. To be one more way that seeds regenerate into more seeds to sustain all of us. Now go out to one, love another, and sow a better world in harmony and peace. Bless all of you. I love you all. Thank you. So we have time for 3 questions. If you have some commentaries or things you'd like to share with me of your own stories, I'll be over at the famous book table, conveniently situated next to this podium. And so I'd be happy to talk with you over there, but I'm happy to entertain 3 questions about something that is going on in this community or something you're interested in, what we're doing in Arizona. And we have a microphone that'll move around, is that correct? Yeah, go ahead.
I can speak loud.
Good.
Gary, it's bothered me since I was very young and saw our expressway system built here. And driving through the monotonous drive to Columbus and all around our United States, I see so much land being mismanaged and used. And I think, how many times has that grass been cut? And how much fuel? And how much time and energy are we investing in cutting the lawns along expressways? How do we fix that?
Boy, we're talking about the beautiful land, rich, fertile land in some cases. They're along our expressways and railroad tracks and power lines too, for that matter. And it's one of the most underutilized resources in the United States. When we got going on the Monarch Butterfly recovery, Dallas, Fort Worth said, we want a monarch corridor all the way up to St. Louis. Lady Bird National Wildflower Center said, we'll take that one on. Missouri Botanical Garden can start at the other end of the corridor, which they've done. Monarch Gardens all the way, 1,000 of them at least, front yard gardens in St. Louis, but all of their parkways are now seeded with milkweeds. I spent 5 years of my life every summer going out and collecting all 18 milkweed species in the Southwest, so that the nursery below our house is now growing 12 of those to put out in the landscape. But it takes 13 species in Ohio. I think we have a total of 18 in Arizona. And so there's a lot, not just the common milkweed, to deal with. And most species need more than 2 milkweeds because they bloom at different times. But it takes that coordination between the highway land managers ramping up the seed production and paying nurserymen to do the planting 3 years out. Because if you collect the seeds this year, sow them next year, they don't start producing significant seed to use for sowing out in the landscape for the 3rd or 4th year. So this takes investment at the start to jumpstart it, and then I think it creates its own wind to keep the wildfire going. And there's other places that are doing these long-term wildlife corridors, whether it's for monarch butterflies or something else, on a scale that we couldn't even imagine 20 years ago. But it takes going to meetings. And I have only one allergy, and that's going to too many meetings. So my wife does a lot of that stuff while I'm out doing the seed collecting for the milkweeds or talking to the nurserymen. And it just takes all different skill sets to bring that through. And I think you're absolutely right. It's the most undervalued land resource we have, and we can do better.
All right, Gary, there's a question back here.
Yes.
Hi. I was just curious because I hear a lot of prominent conservationists and naturalists and all these people who are trying to make change. They say, I went up and I listened. And you guys make it sound so heavenly and wonderful when you're establishing these relationships with people. And I can't imagine it's really that heavenly and just magical, I feel like it has to take a little bit of time. And I've always wondered, how do you introduce yourself and say, I want to help you, but I also want to get somewhere with that progress?
I think you're speaking the truth, that it is uncomfortable at first, especially for someone who's an academic who has 40 kids listening politely hour after hour. Most community members in the meetings I go to say, could you guys quit beating around the bush? You're being paid to be in this community meeting, and I'm a housewife, or I'm a restaurateur, and I have to get back to my family or my staff. Can we come to something solid quicker? And then we get to that point where we say, what do you think is possible? And I think that's the most important thing to ask people of all walks of life. Let's not start with the pie in the sky stuff. What do you think is actually doable? And start focusing on that. And one of those doable things will get done after another. And there are times when I've almost given up on a process and the conversation stops, and a year later people say, okay, we were out of our league in dealing with the complexity of this, but we thought it over. Can we start meeting again? And I just got reunited with some people I knew on some really tough issues 30 years ago that we're back in conversation again because we have confidence in each other. No one has gone away. We all want better stuff. But you're absolutely right. This is hard work because it's emotional work. People have their private property, their aspirations. As one guy said, until you can create more jobs out of this restoration economy than a mine can coming into our community, I'm going to be a skeptic about what you're saying. The day you start creating more jobs in extractive industries, I'm on board. And so it's tough work, but I just can't tell you it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done, because I've seen ranchers and environmentalists that were suing each other stop and say, I was wrong about you. You came through and helped me avoid a lawsuit. And we went to high school together and we hadn't talked for 20 years, and I want to apologize to you. And the other person said, no, I won't let you apologize to me because I need to apologize to you. And then two 50-year-old men broke down crying and hugging each other. And this isn't in Hugsville, California. This is in redneck communities in the desert. And so you're right. It is hard work, and I don't want to underestimate that. Thank you for making that obvious.
All right, one more great question. Here we go.
Hi, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the homogeneous diet. I'm not quite sure I get that's leading to obesity. What is homogeneous about our diets more than it was years ago?
That's a really good question. I sort of glanced over that. So your skepticism in what I said there is well-deserved. Look, the people that I live nearby, the Pima and Papago Indians, have the highest rate of diabetes in the world. And now adult onset diabetes is hitting 10-year-olds. And when we look at their historic diet, what was in that diet was foods that we now call slow release, low glycemic index, chemopreventive foods that could control blood sugar levels to the degree that diabetes was never expressed because there was no pancreatic stress from what they ate. They were exercising more too. So I never want to say that this is all about diet and not about physical fitness. But, and the third factor is the loss of the gut microbiome, the probiotics that are been gone for most of the diet. But when we put people back on a diet that was their ancestors' diet, and it's not about romanticizing their ancestors, it's that some of these things are high antioxidants, are rich in galactomannan gums and other things that not only lower blood sugar levels, but increase insulin sensitivity. The more of those different foods that we put back in the diet, the more their pancreatic stress goes down, their blood sugar levels go down, and their insulin sensitivity goes up. So the diversity of the secondary chemicals in our diet, eating different kinds of apples, eating different kinds of stone fruits, eating every kind of fruit that you can get in your diet, is the food rule that Michael Pollan forgot in his book, Food Rules. That a diversity of nutrients in your diet is inevitably one of the best strategies you can have for dealing with nutrition-related diseases. And it's because these things often have a lot more fiber, a lot more phenols and antioxidants that help slow down these nutrition-related diseases and even things like cancer. So that's a little thumbnail sketch. If you want more information, we can talk, or you can read the book that Thane mentioned, Why Some Like It Hot. It's also called Foods, Gene, and Culture. And ironically, that book was a dud in the United States. Thane's probably the only guy that ever read it in the United States. But the interesting thing, where people get the connection between food, landscape, and culture, that book's been a bestseller. Italy, Brazil, and Mexico. So go figure, published 10 years before any of those countries in the United States fell flat on its butt. And in countries where people get those relationships, they say, oh, we're talking about it all the time, because that reinforces some of the things that we already know from our own culture. So it's not that I invented anything new in that book. It's all right in front of us. So thank you all for coming here.
That's right.
I'd be happy to talk to you over here.
And Gary, thank you very much for this. As Gary joked a little bit earlier, he said we shouldn't let 21 years pass before he comes again, because we won't be here, so we better make sure to bring him back sooner. His book, Where Our Food Comes From, is for sale over here. Also, Dr. Nabhan will be there signing some books. I also want to thank Christina Anderson, who I work with every day. She pulls these together. There's an old saying that the zoo's not a place, it's an event. And I can tell you one thing, we have plenty of events, and most of them happen because of the energy and good spirit of Christina Anderson. So here's to that. Thank you all for coming. Be safe. Give everybody an elbow bump. We'll get through it. Thank you.